right, let's bring in our panel to all of this. We've got Fox Business Network's Edward Lawrence, we've got market watcher Michelle McKinnon, and Deep Digital Chairman Dave Maney. Edward, your thoughts on the no middle ground that the president is laying out here? That tape is going to be there, and we're going to keep going back to that because it's the strongest he's ever been on this issue. It's all or nothing. And consistent with the administration. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer says that he does not want a partial deal. He's working towards a full deal on this. They would like to see everything included in this. You know, it's interesting, though, you say that American companies are paying these tariffs. 437 of those companies now don't have to pay as many. That's the new items that have been excluded from this list. And it's a large amount of items related.
Well, I was happy to hear Christmas lights now are saved, patio torches are saved, skateboards. Right. I know you're big into that.
Yes, back in my younger days. Right. Electric trucks that are self-propelled electric trucks, which is something Amazon has said that they're going to go towards. So that is also exempted now coming in. So some big items that basically guts a lot of the tariffs that are in place. This is the concessions, though, that the Chinese were looking for. Our Chinese sources were saying that going into this week, they were looking for discussions on rolling back some of the tariffs. And this could be seen as rolling back some of the tariffs. Now, our Chinese sources are saying that possibly we could now see another announcement of a large agriculture buy, either later on today when the statement comes out related to how these talks went, or next week when the smaller part of that group that's here in Washington, or that is in Washington, D.C., goes to the farm countries and visits farms.
You know, Michelle, that it's one thing for the Chinese to say they're going to buy more agricultural goods, though. They don't. Wasn't that the thing that made the last deal fall apart? Because they say they're going to do something, but they don't.
Here's the thing, and kind of to your point of the all or the nothing. I mean, the way that I'm looking at it as, yes, obviously the U.S. economy is much stronger than China at the moment. But I think both parties are now looking, well, hold on a minute. We have a lot to lose. And I think you won't necessarily get a trade deal, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get some type of ceasefire here shortly.
And I'm wondering whether these overtures, Dave, are a step in that direction. The Chinese had already indicated, last week, some of the items we were targeting were going to exempt. I didn't understand what a lot of those items were, like processing oils for fuel widgets or something like that, whatever. But they did that. We do this. In other words, good faith gestures. And that is a little different than prior talks, to Edward's point, that might be setting up something. What do you think?
I think so. And keep in mind, you said it's very black and white, what he said. What he said is very black and white, except when he says all or nothing, it's kind of like what the definition of all is, right? Because trade negotiations are shockingly complex, and Edward could tick off the 3 or 4 things and say, well, this kind of means all. This is the cloud that has no real border of exactly what's included in those elements. So my point
But if you don't deal with intellectual property, the stealing
I agree with that.
Let me ask you, if that's not included, there are going to be enterprising and obnoxious journalists like Edward who are going to be fine sticklers for detail and say, wait a minute, you didn't do that, right?
They are, but what will it mean? I don't think any of us could sit on this panel and say, this is what dealing with intellectual property theft will mean, right? So it becomes very easy for both sides in this to ultimately proclaim victory. When they decide they kind of want to play nice, need to play nice, it's not hard. And Edward can pick it apart. I'm not sure that 300 and some odd million Americans will sit there and say, I really understand that that's not really a victory.
Well, I know a lot of viewers who don't put a final stamp on something until they hear it from this man. And so, Edward, if we get something like that, where we're not quite dotting the I's, crossing the T's on the Chinese trying to play fast and loose with our companies that do business over there, how will that be treated?
But I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't. I think that Robert Lighthizer, the entire administration, has actually been very clear in one voice that they are going to protect intellectual property. They are going to make sure that there is some enforcement in an agreement that
and there will be no deal unless they get that.
And there will be, and that is what the president said. Yeah, there'll be no deal unless they can enforce that.
So there's no wiggle room in your mind.
In my mind, from who I've talked to, all of the folks in D.C., there is no wiggle room on intellectual property. Now, there's also, we're hearing discussions this week about possibly laying out a plan for the Chinese to stop or reduce the number of forced joint ventures. And that's where some of that intellectual property happens, is that if a Chinese company owns 51% of your company, then you have to give up your technology or how you make stuff.
Do you think there's a list of 100 things that they say, if I don't get all 100 of these, Is it that definitive? Because if it is, I'm just saying
I don't know if
nobody in
it's
America
100.
knows what it is.
Right. I don't think it's 100, but I think you're going to have to see some enforcement from the administration, some enforcement in a deal saying that if you break intellectual property, they already have the mechanism. The mechanism is there. They're going to have meetings at the local level, or the monthly meetings with the staff, and then quarterly meetings with the deputy level, and then semi-annual meetings, and all tariffs would be on the table at that semi-annual meeting if a dispute over intellectual property is not set. So that mechanism was agreed upon, and it is there in the deal. They're trying to figure out the language to bind China to that memechanism.
All right, I have no idea what you said, but it sounds very impressive. I'm worried already. No, I know you have an opportunity to talk to the Boston Fed President Rosengren, right?
Eric Rosengren.
And he was the one who was one among the dissenters, arguing, in his case, we don't need any stimulus. So he was against the rate cut. How big is this division?
Well, I mean, it's very divided, Fed. In fact, we had 3 dissensions in this last FOMC meeting.
He would have gone for half a point cut, right?
The Bullard was for, he wanted 50%, right. So, and that's what my point I was getting to, is that the last time we had a dissension on 2 different directions like this of 3 people was in 2014, 5 years ago. So this is a very divided Fed going in here, which way they should go in terms of stimulus for this. Eric Rosengren believes that, if we incentivize people with low interest rates, they will make risky behaviors, risky moves. And he believes that increases the financial risk to the system. And that's basically his philosophy on this problem. Bullard believes, the St. Louis Fed president says, that inflation is basically undershooting. We're looking at deflation possibly in some areas. So we need to use our bullets now before something turns down.
And he's also talking about a manufacturing recession.
And he's talking about a manufacturing recession.
Michelle, let me ask you a little bit about that. Presumably the reason for the quarter-point cut, they wave off the notion, well, the rest of the world's going to zero interest rates. We have to keep up or keep down with that, I guess. But it was the official headline was, we're doing this because of the trade uncertainties. Now, obviously, the Federal Reserve is worried enough about that to keep that vigilance on, that if this really begins to suck the economy, the president says it's not, then they're going to move again. Where does this go?
Not sure. But I think the markets are pricing in an additional cut. Certainly the bond market is pricing in an additional cut.
What's the latest number then? Not for 6 weeks from now, but by the end of the year, we're going to see one more quarter-point cut.
One more quarter-point cut. I mean,
I agree.
Here's the thing. Like, I can understand where both parties that we just mentioned are coming from, right? The U.S. has an extremely strong consumer. There's no need to cut. But then when you look around globally, you have negative yielding rates, and then that's pushing our long-term bonds down, and therefore you get an inverted yield curve. So it's a complicated subject, and I think, the Fed at the end of the day is doing what it thinks is best, and I think trade and the uncertainty of trade is absolutely scaring them.
I'm just wondering, Dave, how far they can push it, right? If, to Edward's point, there's division for whatever reason, you have 3 members dissenting, then I don't know what the next call would have universal support one way or the other.
Yeah, whether it would or not, and frankly, how kind of diluted the weapons have become, right? I mean, you can make an interesting argument that interest rate moves in a world in which we don't have as much company purchase of capital goods. Right? There's much more kind of, I can buy this by the SIP, I can buy this off the cloud, I can do just the piece I need. There is that thing that says to me that the old levers don't work the way they did in a kind of a pre-sharing economy sort of thing. So even if there's bullets still in the armory, I'm just not sure they're quite as deadly as they used to be.
Do you guys think there is significance to this October 1st, 70th anniversary of Communist China, that the Chinese want this settled by then? The administration is trying to lever that date to get a deal. What do you think?
I mean, settled by then, that's not going to happen.
I was going to say, that's
absolutely
highly unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the administration is showing some good faith, and the Chinese are obviously playing off of that good faith in what their agriculture buys that they're doing. They do appreciate the fact that the increase in tariffs was delayed for 15 days to October 15th. It's an important date to them. I don't think
my own curiosity is if the geopolitical tension between China and the U.S. is fundamentally useful to the Chinese. Because I think if it is, if they're
rallying support
in their kind of hegemonistic sort of world, if it's useful, then my guess is they play with it as long as they want to play with it.
Well,
if it's not useful, they won't.
You buy
we'll
that
be
notion that
interested-
China needs it more than we do, though? I mean, I know
you can
they
see
lie
that in
about their numbers.
numbers.
Well, they're growing at a 6% clip. That's 3 times our. Now, I know they lie
If
about
you
it.
believe
I get
them.
agree.
And
But
look at
they're
the
not in a
cash.
depression.
The cash that they're infusing.
Yeah.
The president talks about job losses. We don't know exactly how many job losses they have, but we counted some 50 companies that are either moved their supply chain or looking at moving their supply chain. 35 Chinese companies have notified
they're
their
worried
stock
about that.
markets.
Yeah, but didn't
And
you
that's
think that was
permanent
going to
damage.
happen regardless because the Chinese economy is moving to more of a consumer-based economy?
Could be, except in technology. They're looking to become the manufacturer of all technology. But that going back to that October 1st date, it's interesting to see what happens after that date. If the Chinese are as amenable after that date, now that they've gotten through their
Oh, that's
celebration.
interesting. We haven't done even a sign of something, then we can just
I mean,
wait it
leading
out.
up to it is nice. We need this date because it's our anniversary.
Right.
Afterwards, let's see what happens.
All right. We're going to take a quick break here.